Excellent. Well, it is such a pleasure to be speaking to you tonight. I do wish that I could have been there with you in person. The Egyptian Studies Society has amazing hospitality that I have been the recipient of on a number of occasions. The reception at Bill and Nancy's is always so much fun. And also milk and cookies after the talk. I'm really going to miss that, getting a chance to have discussions with you after the talk is over. My title tonight is What's in a Name? Using Royal Titularies to Illuminate the Late 19th and Early 20th Dynasties in Egypt. Now, the organization of the talk is going to be as follows. We'll first start with a discussion of how the royal titulary came into being and what each of the names signifies. And then we'll take a look at some select examples that can give us some kind of idea of information that one can glean from these names. Obviously, with almost 200 pharaonic examples to choose from, we don't have time to look at all of them, and there are quite a few intriguing examples. But we can focus on a few that I think will help us to see the ways that these titularies can be informative. And finally, we'll shift our attention to the late 19th and early 20th dynasties, the successors of Merneptah up until Ramesses III, to see how those names might illuminate the political and historical background of their reigns. Now, whether royal or not, an individual's name, the Egyptian word ren, is an essential part of a person's essence and identity in ancient Egypt. And in fact, the act of naming itself is profoundly important, as can be seen in important religious texts such as the Memphite theology. The desire to have names endure and to remain for all time is a common longing for both royal and non-royal persons. A passage from the Book of the Dead is titled, "Spell for Causing the Name of the Deceased to be Remembered in the Afterlife." Now, here's an example of a non-royal daughter of an official named Iri Neferu, who is actually carrying out that request for her father. Here you see the inscription, "It is his daughter who causes his name to live, Mut Akhet." The name of the father is Iri Neferu. It's on an inscription that's just prior to this one, but you can see in the latter part of the inscription here, the name of Mut Akhet. And interestingly, by taking credit for causing her father's name to live, Mut Akhet is actually also causing her own name to live. Anyone who would be reading this inscription would be causing her name to live simply by saying it. Also note that in decorative arts as well, such as statuary or relief carving, the most important identifier is the name itself. You can see this in the many usurpations of monuments by later pharaohs where only the name has been changed. Simply the act of engraving the name on the monument sufficed to change the identity of the person depicted. Here's an example from Luxor Temple showing a figure that was originally King Tutankhamun, but through careful manipulation of the cartouches, actually now these names, rather than reading Tutankhamun's names, actually have Horemheb's names. And simply by the act of changing these names, now this entire decorative scene belongs to Horemheb himself. A second example is this dyad, originally of Amenhotep III and the crocodile god Sobek. It's currently in Luxor Museum. Originally it stood in Luxor Temple. This statue was later usurped by Ramesses II. And his titles, both on the statue in the front and also on the back of the statue, all up and down the back column, Ramesses II's names and titles actually are there. And so by the act of him putting his own names on this statue, then this statue and this image becomes Ramesses II, is no longer Amenhotep III. And my favorite example, this Sphinx was actually created in the Middle Kingdom by the pharaoh Amon Mhet III. And it has been appropriated multiple times. So first, Ramesses II appropriated it. You can see Ramesses II's cartouches and his titles on the base of the statue. Later, his son Merneptah actually came and put his own names and titles right here on the shoulder. And then finally, Susenes I of the 21st dynasty put his name, his cartouche, right between, sort of on the chest between the forelegs here. Now, Susenes I ruled in the 21st dynasty, so that's roughly the 11th century BC. So this one statue actually got about 1,000 years of use simply by changing the names that are present on that statue. Now, in this relief, you'll actually see another common way of someone giving due deference to a king. In this case, it's a very prominent official. I actually mentioned this particular individual in the article for the Ostrakhan that I just did. This official's name is Bey, and he is giving homage and showing deference to a king, but he's not showing honor and deference to the image of this king. The king's name is Septa. He's actually just showing homage and deference to the names of the king. So here the names are actually a perfect substitute for the king himself. Now, if the desire to have names endure for all time is a paramount, then conversely, the erasure or forgetting of a name is seen as tantamount to negating the very existence of a person. It was no less than annihilation. This could be unintentional, such as maybe just natural decay, or it could be intentional, as with the practice of damnatio memoriae. This is a Latin phrase meaning condemnation of memory, and was practiced in other ancient cultures besides Egypt. This involved removing names from inscriptions and monuments, which in effect erased those individuals from history. Now, two very notable examples from Egyptian history are the 18th dynasty pharaohs Hatshepsut and Akhenaten. Here you can see part of a wall in Karnak Temple, which actually showed originally Hatshepsut's image and her titles. And in this case, both the image and the titles of Hatshepsut have been erased. Sometimes, rather than the erasure of a name, the alteration of a name can actually serve the same purpose of desecrating someone's memory. You basically would have something like a name distortion. Some of the conspirators that were involved in the murder of Ramesses III, for example, had their names changed. So the names weren't erased, the names are simply changed in order that they become curses. So I'll give you one example. Ramesses, which means really Ra is his creator, had his name changed to Ramesses, which means Re is his hater. So from Re is his creator to Re is his hater. So that's one way that you could have the name become so important, but an alteration there really turning that into a curse. Now, kings honored and caused the names of their predecessors to live again by reading aloud their names and having them inscribed in lists, such as this one, known as the Abydos Kings List from the Temple of Seti I. It depicts the 19th dynasty pharaoh Seti I here. He holds a censer, basically an incense burner, and in front of him is his little crown prince, Ramesses II, or future Ramesses II. And Ramesses holds a papyrus scroll in front of him. And what is included on that scroll basically are what you see visually to the right of him, these 76 names. And these are names of kings that came before Seti I. And those 76 names are not a complete list by any stretch of the imagination, but they are a selective list of kings. And by reading these names, just the names and depicting just the names, these individuals are being are having their names and their memories continue to exist. The omission of certain names, however, means that the opposite is happening. Those individuals will not be remembered. And so if you kind of remember that practice of damnatio memoriae that we just talked about, leaving kings out And it's interesting, by the way, to see who gets left out of this particular list. Notably, the Amarna pharaohs are left out, but also the female pharaohs, Sobekneferu and Hatshepsut, are left out as well. Now, in fact, the selective remembrance of certain predecessors and deliberate omission of others is a common way of sort of eliminating individuals that are not deemed legitimate. Here you can see another king's list, this time from the Ramesseum, so the mortuary temple of Ramesses II. And this is a procession that shows ancestors of Ramesses II that are being honored at ceremonies as part of the Festival of Men. Now, this image is very small, so you just have to trust me that there are 19 cartouches on this particular scene. And in each case, these 19 kings are sort of statues of them are being carried around by priests. And in front of the statues, identifying who these individuals are their cartouches. But once again, it's a selective list. These are the sort of immediate predecessors of Ramesses II. Who are not included? Well, Hatshepsut, not included. The Amarna pharaohs, not included as well. Now, in a similar list on Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, you find a very similar scene. Ramesses III emulated Ramesses II in many ways, from naming his children the same names to downright copying decorative schemes such as this one. This is once again a scene of the Festival of Men ceremonies with statues of former kings, and once again, their names are in front of them in cartouches and they're carried by priests. This is basically a list of kings. So this is Ramesses III. This is the 20th dynasty. He's including kings that have just preceded him. And basically what you have is sort of an official edited view of the 19th dynasty. So you get names like Ramesses III, obviously, he's the one putting this on. Sefnakht, his father, Seti II, Merneptah, Ramesses II, Seti I. But there are some kings that are noticeably absent in the 19th dynasty. Amon Mhet, Septa, the female pharaoh Tusrat, they've all been omitted. In essence, anyone after Seti II and up to Sefnakht have been simply left out on this list. Now we'll shift our attention to a discussion of the royal titulary by using a model, that of Amon Mhet III that you see here. Future kings, like everyone else, received a name at birth, and these birth names were significant, as will be discussed shortly. From the Old Kingdom down until the end of Pharaonic Egypt, kings received an additional 4 names on their coronation day, and the coronation day, the Feast of Coronation, usually occurred a short duration after the accession to the throne. We're not exactly sure how much separation there would have been. These 5 names taken together actually are what scholars refer to as the fivefold titulary, and what the ancient Egyptians referred to as nekbet. And so this Egyptian word up here, nekbet, actually can refer to the entire titulary. In fact, that's usually the way that it's referred to. When any one of these names might be referred to individually, these would be more generically referred to as Rinware, the great name. Now, the oldest of the 5 names is the Horus name. And this identifies the king with the falcon god Horus, the son of Osiris and the god of kingship. Now, if we go back to this previous slide, notice that these various names come into being at certain points in time. And so, although I can make the comment that from the Old Kingdom all the way through to the Ptolemaic period, you have those fivefold titulary in effect, really, if you look at when those names appear for the first time, you'll notice that the Horus name, the two ladies' name, the Nepti name, those are as early back as the first dynasty. But really the next name to appear, the fivefold titulary, is the Horus of Gold name. And that doesn't appear until Dynasty IV, and also the son of Re. And the last one is actually the Prenomen. And so these sort of gradually appear. And in fact, really, it's not until the Middle Kingdom that the fivefold titulary is fixed and that you get the order that you see right here. And so it does take a while for this actually to appear. All right, so let's take a look then at the Horus name. This is, remember, Amon Mhet III's Horus name. And so his Horus name, the Horus, great of might. Let's look at the pieces for that particular Horus name. So the Horus name consists basically of three iconographical elements. At the top is the falcon god Horus, who is perched on top of a seraph. That's the Egyptian word to make known, which is actually a schematic rendering of a two-dimensional niched facade of a mud brick palace. And then inside the ground plan of the palace is placed the king's name, as can be seen here in this stela of Jet right here. And so the name of this king is right here. This is a massive stela, originally outside in front of his tomb. And so Jet is there. Basically, what this is kind of saying, if you're going to read this particular name here, it's something like the current incarnation of Horus, Jet, who resides in the palace, okay, with the idea of the association there, the king and Horus being identified together. Now, I mentioned the Horus name. It's the earliest one. This goes all the way back to the sort of late pre-dynastic, early dynastic era. And you can see here on this lovely little jar label from Abydos in the first dynasty. Here I'll put the outline up for you so that you can actually see. And there's so many iconographic elements, even on this very small label, that it serves to illustrate the Horus name, which is right here. And this is the Horus name of Din. But you also have other iconographic elements that are going to be a part of pharaonic history for a very long time. This is a massive Renpet sign here, the sign for year that sort of frames this whole label. Here is the sort of Sed festival that is happening right here. The king himself, Din, he's here as well, but he's also sitting here on his throne under this little booth, if you will. And so you can see this Horus name being present from very early on in Egyptian history. The next of those names, the Nebti name, or the two ladies' names, actually represents two goddesses, Nekhbet and Wadjet, who are both placed on top of baskets. Nekhbet is the vulture goddess of the city El Kab in Upper Egypt, and Wadjet was a cobra goddess of Lower Egypt. So in effect, this is showing the king's control of the two lands, both Upper and Lower Egypt. Here you can see a nice, beautiful carved image of Nekhbet and Wadjet right here. And then on the map, you can see the two locations, Buto and El Kab, their domains that give you an idea of the control over the two lands. The next name, the Horus of Gold name, for Amon Mhet III, this simply meant enduring of life, but the Horus of Gold name is one that, in fact, would take on a lot of militaristic kind of language. And I'll talk about some of those a little bit later on in the lecture, but probably what's going on here, this one has, I think, the most uncertainty surrounding it is why Horus of Gold? Possibly because gold being the skin of the gods. Once again, the falcon being associated with Horus as well. You can certainly see some beautiful jewelry of the sort of Horus of Gold and as being part of that name, but you find some of the most fascinating royal titularies that are part of that name, as we'll discuss a bit later. And then I think probably the most prominent names are the ones that people seem to remember largely because they are put in a cartouche. You've got, in Amon Mhet's case here, the Prenomen, or the throne name. And actually the throne name was the latest of the titulary to be introduced. So we're talking about 5th dynasty here. It's preceded by what we translate as Nisut Bit, which literally means something like he to whom the sedge and the bee belong. So you've got the sedge plant and you've got this bee. It typically has been translated as king of Upper and Lower Egypt. In fact, I think almost any grammar that you would look at up until probably the early 90s and many historical books would use that to frame king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Scholars since kind of don't like that, and they're kind of moving towards another way of referring to this as dual king, you'll hear. The sedge plant is representative of Upper Egypt, and the B sign is emblematic of Lower Egypt. So I still don't think those are too problematic, but dual king is really probably the more common way to translate this now. This name also usually incorporates the sun god Re, and that's done in a way that's honorific transposition. So that simply means that the sun hieroglyph comes first in the spelling of the name, whether or not the sun is actually pronounced first. And finally, the nomen, the son of Re name, and this is the birth name. So this is the name that is probably most familiar. If you can sound it out and you can read, you can see the name here, Amon Mhet. This is the name by which you'll find in almost any history of Egypt book or any Egyptological piece of literature today. It's the name that we typically know them by. So if we speak of a Mhet, if we speak of a Ramses, if we speak of a Tutmosis, we're talking about the son of Re name, the birth name. This, however, is not the most common way that the pharaoh himself would have been presented in legal documents and even in foreign correspondence, but it's the name that we most often use. So when we're sometimes confused today because why are there 11 Ramesses, just understand that the fivefold titulary was not quite as confusing as simply looking at the birth name itself. So in the fivefold titulary here, in the case of Amon Mhet would have been his birth name. The Sa Re bit is going to be added upon the coronation day when the full fivefold titulary is going to be introduced. And I've got an example for you to give you a sense of how these fivefold titularies are actually promulgated. And this example, there's a lot here, so bear with me, but this is from the reign of Tutmosis III. This is his promulgation of his actual coronation and his throne name. So Re established my royal risings and conferral of the titulary. So notice nekbet being used here. Notice also the idea that the names are being given through divine proclamation, right? So Re conferred these upon me himself. He established my falcon upon the Seraph panel and strengthened me to be mighty bull and caused me to rise within Thebes. And this my name of Horus, victorious bull, risen in Thebes. Get the idea, there's a narrative that goes along with the name itself. He caused me to raise up the two ladies, all right, Nebti, and made the kingship, my kingship last like that of Re in heaven. And this my name, he of the two ladies, enduring a kingship like Re in heaven. He fashioned me as a falcon of gold, here's the golden Horus name, and gave me his force and his strength. I was holy in those his divine risings. In this my name of Horus of Gold, sacred of appearances and powerful of might. He caused me to rise, he of the sedge and the bee, so dual king, and established my forms as those of Re, and this my name of dual king, Lord of the two lands, Menkheper Re. I am his son who emerged out of him, the image of birth, like the god presiding over Heseret, and he united all my forms, and this my name of son of Re, Tutmosis, united in form, living forever and eternity. So that's kind of an idea of the evolution of the names themselves and also how they might be promulgated. We'd love to have more inscriptions like this one that actually give us a sense of the full name kind of being published, if you will, and to know how that came about for each pharaoh. Now, let's just take a look at one quick example before diving into the 19th and the 20th dynasty a little bit to kind of get an idea of the kind of information that you could glean from just the titulary itself. And here we'll take a look at the second dynasty. So this is when only two names were actually being written at this particular time. And we'll look at a second dynasty example, the pharaoh Peribsen. And we've already talked about the fact that the Horus name is surmounted by the Horus falcon. So why does Peribsen actually have a Seth animal that surmounts his particular Serach? There's been a lot of discussion about that, and most scholars believe that there was some kind of contention between maybe followers of Seth and followers of Horus as early as the Second Dynasty, and that what you might be seeing here, preceding Peribsen, the Horus falcon was used. With Peribsen, he only uses the Seth animal. Might this be evidence that, in fact, there was hostility between Peribsen and the followers of Seth and those of Horus? And here you can kind of get a sense in later Egyptian mythology, obviously, Horus and Seth are always at odds. If you've ever read the contendings of Horus and Seth, you get a very good idea of that sort of animosity between the two. But also, if you've read the contendings of Horus and Seth, you know that, and throughout mythology, Horus wins out in the end. Well, in this case, the successor of Peribsen is an individual by the name of Kasekem. And Kasekem, in his Horus name, at first actually simply puts the Horus animal, the falcon, on top of his Serach. And later in his reign, during his reign, actually changes his name from Kasekem to Kasekemwi. So Kasekemwi basically is talking about the two powerful ones have appeared and are at peace in him. And notice, and this drawing might make it a little clearer what's going on here, the final version of his Horus name actually includes both the Horus falcon and the Seth animal. And scholars believe that this probably indicates that Kasekemwi was able to win out in whatever contentious battle between the forces of Seth and to bring an active unification again with those forces. And so this is what you see here. And in fact, in this kind of odd-looking Serach, it almost appears as if the Horus and the Seth are sort of, kissing and making up or something. But nonetheless, here's an example of a Horus name that actually undergoes some pretty significant change, and probably what's hiding behind that is a lot of contention and animosity between some factions here. Now, just to give you an overview or a sense of what we're kind of heading into, the 19th dynasty, and really I'll focus on just the very end of the 19th dynasty and the transition to the 20th here. But this is the famous dynasty made famous by Ramesses II, made famous by Seti I. And there really are no issues with those particular pharaohs. We know quite a bit. In fact, maybe we have more information than we want when it comes to a figure like Ramesses II. However, the final individuals, Septa and Tusrat especially, we have a lot less information about them. And I did my dissertation on the late 19th dynasty. And, when you're researching individuals that do not have a lot of information in the monumental record, every scrap of evidence that you have is incredibly important. You comb through and sift through everything because there may be something hidden in some of that information that you're looking at. So everything becomes all the more important. Well, Septa, we'll start with him. If you look at this lovely image, this is from his tomb, KV 47 in the Valley of the Kings. And it's a beautiful, wonderful image here of a young king in the full of his life. I'll warn you that the next image is going to be to show human remains, which is the mummy of Septa himself. You can actually see that the reality is far from this lovely idealized image. Septa, through examination of his mummy, seems to have died at a pretty young age. He seems to have had some kind of condition, probably polio of some particular kind. You can kind of see the foreshortening of the leg going on here. And the reason I show this to you is there are a number of things about Septa himself that make him vulnerable. And here, I'm not simply talking about the young age. I'm not simply talking about his physical condition. Both of those undoubtedly would have made him vulnerable. But I'm also talking about the fact that for most of those other pharaohs that we see in the 19th dynasty, we usually can point back to a figure who is their father. And so they are completely legitimate because we can say they were the son of a previous king. For Septa, we have a bit of a conundrum, which is that we actually do not know who his father was. And he just appears. We don't have him in the monumental record before he actually becomes pharaoh. And he takes a set of titularies, which there's nothing that unusual about them. But what is very interesting about Septa, if you think about what titularies can tell us, is that his nomen, when he first comes to the throne, is Ramesses II. That's in year 1. By year 3, he has a different nomen. His nomen is actually Merneptah Septa. Now, remember that the nomen, this is the birth name, right? So you're born with this name. It's a pretty significant change to change your birth name. Why in the world would Septa be changing his birth name from Ramesses Septa to Merneptah Septa? Well, this is something that I've looked into a little bit. What reasons might he have for changing this name? Well, remember that we are not necessarily certain. We don't know who his father actually was. There are several inscriptions which actually talk about an important official by the name of Bey. And here you can see in this image, this is actually in Aswan. You can see an image of Septa here seated on his throne. Behind him is an official named Bey. And over here on this last column of inscription here, it talks about Bey, this official, actually placing Septa upon the throne of his father. Now, wouldn't it be amazing if he mentioned what father that actually was? But he doesn't. He simply says that he places the king on the throne of his father. Now, that particular statement, by the way, is completely unprecedented. Gods are said to place kings on the throne of their fathers. Mere mortals are not to be placing kings on the throne of their fathers, no matter how important they actually are. And so that is highly significant there. But yet, in another inscription, this one at Jebel el-Silsila, this is the speos of Horemheb, and maybe the line drawing will give you a little better idea of what is seen here. Here, almost on the same scale, actually, you've got Septa standing before the god Amun, and behind Septa is this official Bey. And the final inscriptions over here also are saying the exact same thing, that Bey has established the king on the throne of his father. Now, once again, does not mention the name of the father. So it's a mystery who that father might have been. If Septa's father was in fact the previous pharaoh, whose name was Seti II, by the way, if his father was Seti II, there would be no reason probably for an official declaring that he placed someone on the throne of his father, because you would simply have Septa claiming that Seti II was his father, all right? And therefore that line would have been completely legitimate. The fact that Seti II is never claimed to be the father of Septa himself is very interesting. And when you start to look at the kind of importance that this particular individual is able to, I'm talking about Bey here, is able to have in being a power behind the throne. When you see unprecedented statements like, I have placed you on the throne of your father. When you see in the mortuary temple, now we don't have the mortuary temple of Septa, it's long since probably dismantled by some of his successors, but nonetheless, the foundation blocks from the mortuary temple of Septa, it's very common, of course, to have the name of the king or names of the kings in the foundation of their temples, with the idea that even if the temple somehow one day is torn apart, the foundations will betray the fact that the temple was there and it belonged to that particular king. So I guess you could say in Septa's case, mission accomplished, because Petrie found these foundation deposits. What's interesting is that Petrie didn't just find foundation deposits in Septa's mortuary temple that had Septa's cartouche names. And by the way, if you were just simply looking at the name itself, this is Merneptah Septa. So you would know that when that foundation was put into place, it's after year 1 of Septa at the very least. But also next to Septas cartouches is a lovely block with the name and title of this Chancellor Bey. And so if you put these pieces together, the reason I think, and this is conjecture, why would you change your name from Ramesses Septa to Merneptah Septa? It could be that what Septa is actually trying to do is to indicate his lineage. And it's possible, and here you have to think about the fact that when Merneptah came to the throne, he's the 13th son of Ramesses II. He's probably very old at that point, early 60s probably at the youngest. And he had a number of sons and a number of grandsons as well. And so it's possible that Septa is not the son of Seti, who was the son of Merneptah. He could possibly be the son of another of Merneptah's sons, or he could be a grandson, if you think of how long Merneptah actually lived. And so it's possible that Merneptah here is actually the claim that he is trying to sort of link himself with, that he is sort of closer to Merneptah than he is, say, doesn't claim that Seti's his father, but Ramses is sort of a little too distant. And so it may be that he is sort of showing some affiliation with Merneptah. Now, the story does not end well for Chancellor Bey. So here's the thing, when you have this unprecedented status as a non-royal, sometimes there's the danger of continuing to overreach. And the Chancellor Bey absolutely was guilty of overreaching, and he does not get away free. Here you can see a wonderful find by Pierre Grandet in the early 2000s, where he, this was a sort of archaeological find in the museum, if you will, where he pieces together several different pieces of an ostracon, and lo and behold, what he found shocked him and actually helped to rewrite a lot of the history of this particular part of the 19th dynasty. And you can see here, this is actually in Septa's year 5. He rules into his year 6. So this is his year 5. And basically this day, the scribe of the tomb, Passer, has come to announce Pharaoh LPH has killed the great enemy Bey. So that's a pretty significant overstep there, and it gets a pretty significant sort of backlash. And thinking of the name and the importance of the name as well, you can see that he's called the great enemy, and certainly something that will stay with him as long as this ostracon is around. He had a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, another unprecedented thing, KV-13, and that tomb was never going to be used by Chancellor Bey, and we do not have his mummy. Next, we'll take a look at Tusrat's titulary, and this one is very fascinating for a lot of the same reasons as Septa, but we'll take a little bit more detailed look at this. As she came to the throne after the demise of Septa, and remember, I mentioned that you can tell from the evidence, the human remains, that he dies pretty young, probably late teens or maybe early 20s. He doesn't seem to have either married or had any children. As of yet, we have no record of a great royal wife or any wife for him, and there's no record of any children. And the throne is actually going to pass to, so Tusrat is the wife of Seti II. This is the predecessor of Septa, who kind of is a regent alongside of Bey for Septa. When Bey is ultimately executed, and many have wondered if Tusrat was not behind this execution, the person that stood to gain power from that is Tusrat. And so there are some questions as to, did Septa die, from foul play, and did Tusrat have a role in that? It's possible. Nonetheless, when Septa dies, it's Tusrat who is going to come to the throne. Now, females on the throne in Egypt are actually unusual. We tend to think of Egypt being the place that women are able to rule, but this is pretty unusual. And usually it indicates the end of a dynastic line. It operates as kind of a stopgap before a new family line is established. Hatshepsut actually would be an exception here, but it seems to be what is going on here in the late 19th dynasty with Tusrat. Now, Tusrat's most common Horus name is identical to the most prominent one of Ramesses II. We'll talk about this association with Ramesses II because I find it very interesting. Now, you'll note that her Horus name, Kanat Mary Ma'at, strong bull, beloved of Ma'at. Note that she is indeed referring to herself, a female, as a bull. Previous female rulers actually did not do this. So Sobek-Neferu, the 12th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom, Hatshepsut, neither of them actually used the strong bull epithet, Horus name. And so it's a very common Horus name, but it's not common for females. Now, Hatshepsut actually kind of got around this phonetically. She uses the epithet Useret Kau, which means powerful of Kas, where the Ka for bull and the Kau for Kas, the plural for Kas, kind of sound similar. Tusrat's Nebti name, and there's only one example of this Nebti name that we have. It comes from a statue from Heliopolis, and I'll show that in just a minute. Has a very militaristic tone. So here is Gereg Kemet Waf Kasut, one who establishes Egypt and who crushes foreign lands. Now, it's kind of interesting. What are we to make of this? Are we to think that Tusrat is telling us about some military campaign that she was involved in, perhaps in Canaan? Well, if you look at the term waf, so the term waf means to crush or to subdue, right? And that definitely calls to mind the role of the pharaoh as a warrior who neutralizes any threat that foreign peoples might represent, basically by keeping them under his submission. It's been suggested that this title could in fact or in part represent the state of affairs during Tusrat's reign, possibly reflecting incursions into Egypt by foreigners from Western Asia at this time. It's also tempting to read into this the unrest attributed to Asiatics by both the Elephantine Stela and also the Great Horus Papyrus, which precede the rise of the 20th dynasty. We'll take a look at those documents a little bit later. Now, it's possible that this represents some kind of military activity by Tusrat. However, two things we should take note of. One, this particular name, Gereg Kemet Waif Kasut, is almost exactly the same Nebti name as that for Ramesses II. His is Mek Kemet Waif Kasut, one who protects Egypt and crushes foreign lands. So what Tusrat does is basically substitute the word Mek, which means to protect, for Gereg, to establish. Two, Ramesses II's Nebti name is actually identical to a variant of Seti II's Nebti name. Now remember that Seti II is Tusrat's husband. So it's possible that Tusrat was linking herself to her deceased husband for legitimacy. He was the crown prince of Merneptah, so he was a legitimate pharaoh, although there were some issues with a usurper named Amon Mhet that he had to overcome. It may also have been convenient that both of these particular names linked back to Seti II and Ramesses II. So it's possible that it just by mere convenience, she was able to take advantage of the fact that her husband happened to have this title, but it also belonged to Ramesses II. And I think that probably is the stronger claim here. We don't possess a golden Horus name for Tusrat. Almost certainly she had one, but her monumental evidence is simply quite slim. Now, her prenomen and nomen are also very interesting, and they were actually arranged so that the casual observer would think that they were those of Ramesses II. And this is actually something that Petrie pointed out over a century ago when he was excavating originally at what was the remains of the mortuary temple of Septa, but also the mortuary temple of Tusrat, although he did a job that was less than to be desired. Thus the reason Richard Wilkinson and the University of Arizona decided to do a much, much better job. But Tusrat pointed this out in his excavation report of Tusrat's mortuary temple. Petrie pointed this out, and he said, quote, "The form of the cartouches is manifestly copied from those of Ramesses II and ingeniously adapted as a parody or imitation of what was already so utterly familiar to the eyes of every Egyptian in those times. So Tusrat's prenomen, or throne name, and here you can see Sat Re, Mary Amon, daughter of Re, beloved of Amon. Note that the feminine Sat, daughter, right, and not son. This is interesting. There's some interesting parallels between what she does and what other female pharaohs have done as well. And this is her birth name, Tusrat Setep in Mut. And we'll take a look at how she has manipulated her particular cartouche names so that they appear to be very similar to Ramesses II. Now, we had almost verbatim copying from some of her earlier names with Ramesses II. This is not so much copying as it is mimicking the style and the look. So this is meant to almost deceive in a way. So here is Ramesses II's prenomen, all right, Usur Ma'at Re, Setepin Re, and here is Tusrat's nomen, Tusrat, Setep in Mut. Now, her nomen and his prenomen, the arrangements, the way that she has actually arranged her letters makes it appear to be very, very similar. If you just simply are looking at this cartouche, these cartouches on monuments, you could easily glance over at Tusrat's, at her nomen, and think that you are looking at a cartouche name of Ramesses II himself. What Tusrat has done is basically she substituted the bread loaves right here, all right, for where Ramses had the sun disk. She substituted the bread loaves. She has the Usur sign right here, and you still have the Setep in, but right here you have the goddess Mut as opposed to Ma'at. And so slight little subtle changes there that make hers appear to be very similar. So Tusrat Setep in Mut as opposed to Usur Ma'at Re Setep in Re. They sound phonetically almost nothing alike, but it's the appearance which I think is very interesting. If you look at the prenomen of Tusrat versus the nomen of Ramesses II, there's somewhat less of an attempt at imitation. The first part of the cartouche does contain the same three signs as the most common variation of Ramesses II's nomen. And so you do see some similarities here, though I think for my money, I would take Tusrat's nomen and Ramesses II's prenomen as being very, very interesting. Now, one of the most important monuments for Tusrat's titulary is a headless statue, which originally was from Heliopolis. I believe that it's finally being installed in the Grand Egyptian Museum. It was excavated at Medinet Nasser back in the, I believe, the early 70s, maybe 1971 or so. And this includes many of those titles that we've actually seen already. But the reason that I show you this statue is we've talked about ways that Tusrat is sort of tying herself to Ramesses II, all right, the sort of one of the most well-known pharaohs of the New Kingdom, but especially the predecessors of Tusrat. I think what's interesting is that she doesn't simply stop at mimicking his names, but she also works this into how she constructs her own statuary. Now, we only have really one good piece of statuary of Tusrat, and that is this. It's a headless statue, unfortunately, and so we'd love to be able to see what the head actually looks like. But what I find fascinating is it looks remarkably similar to a statue now in the Turin Museum of Ramesses II. She has pretty blatantly, intentionally made her statue look very similar to some of the variants of Ramesses II's statuary as well. And so there's this linking of the names. And in fact, some of those names that appear on here, her cartouches that mimic his are also here. So if you were looking simply at the side of this particular statue and you happen to walk by and you were just looking at Tusrat's nomen, you might mistakenly think that you're looking at a statue of Ramesses II. But in fact, This is of Tusrat. So in statuary, there's a little bit of mimicking going on. Also, and this is thanks to the University of Arizona's Tusrat Temple project, we now know that it didn't stop there, but it continued on even into her actual mortuary temple. In proximity, it's right close to the Ramesseum, and so it's very close. In terms of scale, it doesn't even come close. The Tusrat mortuary temple is very, very small. But nonetheless, in terms of the plan, you can see on the right-hand side here, the temple of Tusrat, the mortuary temple, but the inner part of the Ramesseum, many of these parts were actually modeled on, or Tusrats, I should say, were modeled on those of the Ramesseum. And so there is a lot of linking going on. The names themselves help us to understand what's going on in sort of the larger picture there. In Sethnak's titulary, so Tusrat dies, and we have no mummy for Tusrat. Her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV 14, unfortunately for her, I guess fortunately for Setnak, she was probably never interred in that particular tomb. There are the occasional claims that one of the unknown female mummies in the Cairo Museum may belong to her, but so far none has been identified with any certainty whatsoever. So we're not sure exactly how she dies. Was it foul play? Was it simply old age? What we do know is that her tomb was taken over by Setnak, her successor. He removed and modified all of her images, all of her titles that you find inside the tomb. And so this tomb was simply taken over by Setnak and used for his own particular burial. Now, despite Setnak, and Setnak only ruled, as far as we know, into his 4th regnal year. That has been a recent change with a relatively new stele that was found, I believe in 2007 or so, which gives a 4th regnal year date. Despite the short number of regnal years, basically, we are fortunate we have his entire titulary. And so Sethnak's titulary is also very important for us to sort of unpack some of the details in his reign. His Horus name, Connacht Wer Pechti, strong bull, great of strength, is actually identical to the Horus name of Seti II, but it's also identical to one of his much earlier predecessors, Amon Mhet II. So it's often interesting to see, once again, which of these titles are being copied from earlier predecessors and why exactly they might be doing that. In other literature that we'll talk about in just a second, Setnak continuously is stressing his military accomplishments, his role as restorer. So it's possible that you could think about him intentionally seeking to associate himself with one of the 18th dynasty's great warrior kings, Amon Mhet II. He could be doing this by adopting a similar Horus name. There could also be an honorific nod to Seti II by the choice of this title, as this was the last king to be considered legitimate by the succeeding dynasty. If you remember some of the earlier kings lists that I showed you, Seti II and Medinet Habu, Seti II is depicted there, but after him, none of the other pharaohs are depicted until Setnak. So Seti II was considered legit, even if Septa and Tusrat were not. So there could be an association of that connection with Setnak and with Seti II. There would seem to be a probably stronger connection with Amon Mhet II, simply because of the strong militaristic bent that you find in some of the other titles that he has. Now, in regards to the Nebti name itself, the only significance that you can really sort of draw from that is the fact that this one Nebti name also appears in the titles of Ramesses II and Merneptah, Tut Kau Mi Chinen, the very image of appearances like Tatena. I don't think there's anything too significant in that, so we'll move on to what I think is far more important, which is really the 2 golden Horus names. So I mentioned before, golden Horus names tend to be ones that take on a very martial character. And in fact, Sethnak's 2 golden Horus names are far more illuminating. They both indicate conflict. And as with the Horus name, they seem to be kind of reinforcing the military prowess of the king. You can see in the first of these, Sechem Kepesh Der Reki Uf, powerful, a strong arm, who overwhelms his enemies. Now the verb used, der, here is used to describe how Sefnock defeats his enemies. He overwhelms them by means of his Sechem Kepesh, his powerful arms. It's interesting to note that Sechem Kepesh Der, that whole phrase, also appears in the titularies of Seti I, Ramesses II, and Seti II, all three pharaohs that are known to have some military accomplishments. Now, the full titularies from which these words actually come are in fact identical for all three kings. Sechem, Kepesh, Der, Pejet, Pesjet. And this is made even more interesting when Sefnock's second golden Horus name, here you can see it in front of you, is taken into consideration, for it includes Pejet, Pesjet. So you can see Hui, Pejet, Pesjet, An in Nesit, the one who smites the 9 bows, beautiful in kingship. It seems likely that Sefnock rather cleverly derived both of his golden Horus names from the one example shared by the 3 aforementioned kings. And in keeping with his fondness for borrowing from other pharaohs, like even Seti II, it would seem probably that those kings are being emulated for these particular militaristic reasons. Now, if you take Sefnock's titulary itself, and you combine these with external documentation, one from the reign of Sefnock and then one from actually the reign of Ramesses IV, but there it's looking back on the sort of beginning of the 20th dynasty. I think it helps to illuminate these quite nicely, which is that a stela from Elephantine Island that is from Sefnock himself from the second year, and I'll show you the line drawing at least so you can get a better idea of what this actually looks like. It's very, very damaged. You can see it in the little museum at Elephantine Island today, but it's very damaged, and a lot of this actually has to be sort of reconstructed. So here you can see this is describing a situation that has happened by year second. So the great assembly of the gods is pleased with his plans like Re, since the land had been in confusion. The great god stretched out his arms and selected his person, this is the pharaoh LPH, from among the millions, dismissing the hundreds of thousands prior to him. So what's happening here is in this stela, you've got a sort of divine appointment of Sefnock as being chosen by Re himself to be the new pharaoh and essentially the founder of the 20th dynasty. Now his person, LPH, was like his father Seth, who flexed his arms to rid Egypt of those who had led it astray. So this is interesting. Listen to all the sort of the martial language that's being used here. Fear of him has seized the hearts of opponents before him. They flee like flocks of sparrows with a falcon after them. They left silver and gold, which they had given to these Asiatics in order for them to bring reinforcements. That part is very interesting because you've had this echoed a couple of times now, but the subduing of foreigners are mentioned here, Asiatics, with the idea that maybe either there's some kind of an incursion or some kind of an invasion that's being talked about, or possibly that foreign mercenary soldiers are being used in some kind of a conflict that's going on here. These plans failed, and the plans were futile. And every good god and goddess performed wonders for the good god, proclaiming the one of a slaughter under him. And so basically he's given credit for this great victory on year 2. And here you have something very interesting. You have at the very end of the document, and if you are familiar with stela and dated stela from Pharaoh's reigns, usually the date comes at the very top. So you have the year name and the month and the day of the particular king that is ruling. Well, here, you don't get the year and the date until the very end of the stela. And you get year 2 when this actually happens. Second month of Shimu, day 10, there were no more opponents of his person. So whatever enemy Sefnock is fighting here By year 2 of his reign, he has finally been victorious over them. If you take this particular document, so this is from Sepnak's reign itself. If you take this document, then you can definitely see that you can match up some of this martial language that is in this stela with his titulary as well. If you look at another piece of evidence, this one's not contemporary with Sepnak himself. This one is the Great Horus Papyrus. So this is in the British Museum. It is written at the time of the reign of Ramesses IV. Remember that you've had the harem conspiracy. Ramesses III, Ramesses IV's father, has been killed, and it includes 5 different parts. One of those parts, the last of those, actually includes a historical retrospective. And so what we're going to see here is that retrospective, that look back at the grandfather, if you will, of Ramesses IV. And in the Great Horus Papyrus, you have the same kind of interesting language being used about what is the situation like in Sepnak's reign. The land of Egypt had been banished, every man being a law unto himself. They had no leader for many years previously, until other times when the land of Egypt was in the hands of chieftains and majors. One killed his neighbor, whether high or low. Then another time came, consisting of empty years, when Irsu, a Syrian, was among them as a chieftain, having made the whole land into subjection before him. Each joined with his companion in plundering their goods, and they treated the gods as they did men, and no offerings were made in the temple. But the gods then inclined themselves to peace, so as to put the land in its proper state in accordance with its normal condition, and they established their son, who came forth from their flesh, as ruler of every land upon their great throne. And here you have Sepnak's name. He was Khepri Seth when he was enraged. He set in order the entire land that had been rebellious, and he killed the rebels who were in the land of Egypt. He cleansed the throne, the great throne of Egypt, the ruler of the 2 lands, the throne of Amun. And so here, once again, in this historical retrospective, there is a lot of indication of military conflict that's going on. And once again, you have a foreign element that's actually talked about. This Irsu, which this word name probably means self-made one. So he's an upstart of some kind, but he's a foreigner who seems to have gained some control in Egypt. Some people have thought in the past that maybe Irsu is another way of referring to Chancellor Bey, who some think might have actually been a foreigner, and there may have been some indication that that was who is being referred to here. I don't think so, because one, we know that Chancellor Bey was actually executed in Septa's reign, so he would not have been alive to be a problem for Sepnak. There does seem to be an indication, though, that's pretty consistent with those names and with the Sepnak Stela and the Great Horus Papyrus, that there's a lot of military conflict of some kind. There's some turmoil that's being talked about in these particular documents. We take that and we put one more piece of evidence here. This is an ostracon that was found in the Valley of the Kings inside KV9. It dates to the 20th dynasty. It's unlabeled. There's no names anywhere on here. But scholars believe that possibly the female king on the left is none other than Tusrat. She is in her chariot. She is fighting against an opponent, an enemy, so it's clearly a battle scene. But is it meant to show civil war? In other words, could this possibly be some kind of a civil war between the forces of Tusrat and the forces of Sepnak himself, who would ultimately come to found the 20th dynasty? Or is this an indication maybe of a foreign invasion that Tusrat is attempting to repel? So maybe the forces that she's fighting are, in fact, these foreign forces. And it's possible that if her efforts were unsuccessful in pushing out the foreign forces, maybe she dies in battle as part of that, that the reason that Sepnak is talking about Asiatics and foreign elements is because he sort of has to finish the job. Now, there are unfortunately more questions than answers and looking at these pieces of evidence, but nonetheless, such as the world of reconstructing Egyptian events. Now, taken together, what do we make of this? There's no denying the martial sort of flavor of Sepnak's titulary, especially those golden Horus names. It's also I think those two additional documents really kind of corroborate some kind of conflict. I have external here and sort of in parentheses with a question mark, because I don't know that it's necessarily completely certain. That internal conflict could have been, if we think of maybe foreign soldiers being involved as mercenaries, you could kind of see why Asiatics would be mentioned, but it's not an external invasion, something from within. And a question here may be, are his titles meant to communicate strength and stability after a time of uncertainty? So in other words, they seem to be overly martial and victorious because maybe that weak period that had just preceded him, Tusrat's reign, but also Septa's reign as well, maybe this is a way for him to really sort of show that things are back to normal again, that Egyptian pharaohs are strong, and so using this sort of over-the-top language and tying himself back to individuals like Amon Mhet II. That's definitely a possibility here, I think. Now, if we sort of take all the evidence together and sort of look at this, I think there are some conclusions that we can kind of draw, maybe about the usefulness of sort of investigating royal titularies. So we've seen that titularies can be used in a number of ways. They can be used as a link to the past, to build connections to previous great rulers, and thus potentially providing legitimacy for current kings. They can actually describe current political or diplomatic circumstances, albeit soaked in propaganda. They can also be anticipatory in the sense of indicating what they hope to achieve in their reign. Now, they can, in fact, I think, provide some historical insights, but they must be carefully used alongside the other available documentation whenever available. And as with any Egyptian inscription, they should never, ever, ever be taken at face value. We always need to be careful when the Egyptians are trying to tell us a particular version of events that is supposed to have happened. We have to understand that there's always bias, that they probably are never telling us the complete truth. They are always exaggerating the details. Simply read any and every inscription that Ramesses II ever left us. And so that doesn't mean that what they are saying does not include a historical kernel of truth in it, and it most certainly does in many cases, but we should always be wary to take sort of their version of events. And so I hope that you've kind of seen a little bit of how titularies can, in some cases, give us some insight into the thought processes behind certain pharaohs, ways that they might sort of legitimate themselves, but also how they can be used alongside other pieces of evidence as well, in many cases to corroborate some of what we find outside. Now with that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen tonight, and I welcome any questions that you might have.